Hello and welcome to the second review of Request Month 2017. Today we're taking a look at Commando, originally for PC but later released on PlayStation and oddly enough Sega Saturn. What you're seeing here is the PC version, specifically MS-DOS. This review is coming to you courtesy of Gamma12. He sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. This is what passed for a 3D action-adventure game in 1996, developed by Adeline Software International. At least I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, because it's a French company, so they can have all kinds of goofy things with the way you pronounce their names. Anyway, they're best known for Little Big Adventure 1 and 2, which went under the names Relentless Twinsen's Adventure and Twinsen's Odyssey in the US. So if you're familiar with either of those, then you've played a game by this company. The thing is that they closed down in 2004 after having only released 4 games, of which the only 2 that I see fairly regularly discussed, not even regularly, just fairly regularly discussed, are the Little Big Adventure series. Which of course begs the question of how their other 2 games are. Now one of them is a motocross game that I have no intention of doing a video on, but this one is a bit of a different monster entirely. So let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out exactly what we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, I do have to stress, this game came out in 1996. We are dealing with something that, as far as 3D games go, is considered archaic. So while this was pretty visually impressive back then, these days it looks downright atrocious. Extremely blocky modeling, extremely low-res textures. The backgrounds are all pre-rendered and they're all fairly low-res, so they end up looking kinda ugly, and the characters compared to them look incredibly out of place. There are also some short pre-rendered cutscenes that play in between the levels, and they really do not help things either. I mean, seriously, just look at this. First thing that you're probably wondering is, wait a minute, DW, that wasn't a whole cutscene, was it? Yes, it was. That was a level transition between the Rome stage and the Japan stage. That is what passes for cutscenes in Commando. They look terrible, and they make absolutely no sense whatsoever. This is something I'll get more to when I get to the story bits, but for now, just understand that's what we're dealing with as far as cutscenes go. Now, when you move over to sound design, things get even messier than the visuals. Sound effects at their absolute best are simply passable. When you actually get to the meat of things, they don't sound good at all. What voice acting does exist is incredibly cheesy and pretty bad, which is par for the course for the mid-90s, let's face it. Although unlike in, say, the original Resident Evil, it's not the funny kind of bad, it's just bad. And then there's the music, which is composed of ridiculously repetitive MIDI sequences that really do not do anything for the game. All they really do is expose the dangers of working with MIDI back in the mid-90s and before. If you didn't really know what you were doing with them, then you would end up with soundtracks that really are not very good at all. So even when you take into consideration that this game is over 20 years old at this point, it really does not hold up in terms of presentation at all, and even in its time, there were still better looking games than this. And like all of those early to mid-90s 3D games, this ended up being completely outclassed in the visual department very, very quickly. This of course brings us to what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay, because ultimately, even if the game has aged extremely poorly in terms of visuals, it can still hold up in terms of gameplay and story. The keyword being can, because this game does not hold up in terms of story or gameplay. The story in this is that you are some guy who is trying to destroy the virus that has infected the Historical Tactical Center's central computer system. The idea is that you have to travel through several historical epochs in order to gather a bunch of memory circuits that are not infected with the virus, so you can repair the memory circuits and get rid of the virus? At least that's what the manual says. I'm reading the manual because the game does not give you any indication of story whatsoever. If you were to take the normal approach that people have to playing video games and not read the manual before you play it, then you would have absolutely no idea what is going on. All you would know is that you are some guy in a really goofy outfit traveling through time, killing literally everything in sight. And also there are these weird computer chip things that you keep picking up, and they sort of help a timer meter thingy go down? The game explains absolutely nothing to the player. The cutscenes are all exactly like the one I showed you earlier, where they're just these really short pre-rendered sequences that tell you absolutely nothing about what's going on and leave you more confused than anything else. There's nothing in the game to give you an idea of what's going on. It's not like there's readables anywhere, it's not like anybody's narrating what's going on. You're just running around whacking things to death and picking up items. And the explanation for all of this is that the virus is creating a bunch of virtual enemies based on various historical eras, and you're having to go through these eras in order to gather all of these chips, so those guys are there to stop you in virtual space? Needless to say, the story is beyond slapped together. It seems like something somebody came up with in a completely drunken stupor. It makes less than no sense, and it does absolutely nothing for helping you get invested in the game. The biggest problem with that is that the gameplay does not compensate for this. Ordinarily, in these early to mid-90s games, if the story was not something particularly great, then the gameplay would try to compensate for that. See Doom, for example. It really does not have a complex plot at all. In fact, the plot is just pretty ridiculous, but the gameplay is sublime. And then there's a game like Time Commando, which has a complete gibberish story that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever and honestly at times outright annoys you, and the gameplay is not sublime. Instead, it's atrocious. And it starts with the controls. Now, I can put up with really bad controls if the rest of the game is good. See Gothic, for example. The controls in the first Gothic especially, but also to some degree in Gothic 2, are incredibly terrible. And yet, the game is still really good. Time Commando has a rather similar control scheme. You move around with the arrow keys, you select which weapon you have in your hand with the number keys, and you use the Control and Alt keys to deal with the combat system. Now the Alt key is for dodging. You hold Alt and then you press an arrow key to dodge in that direction. The Control key is used for actual combat, where you hold it down and then you press the arrow keys to deal different attacks. This is both for when you're just doing hand-to-hand without any weapons, as well as when you're actually using weapons. You may think, if you've played Gothic, that this seems like a good idea, because you're like, oh, well, you can do various combos, and you can kind of feint to one side or another. To which I respond, you know what? That really wasn't very useful in Gothic, and in this, it's actually not a very good idea at all. Your basic forward attack is kind of a lunge. It has the longest range of any of your attacks, and thus you're going to want to use it constantly. There's no real finesse to the combat system. Sure, you can parry attacks and you can dodge attacks and such, but the problem is that the controls themselves and the actual in-game registration of your controls are incredibly clunky. And there are two major reasons for this. One, the movement itself is really slow. You feel like you're moving at a snail's pace no matter what you're doing, and turning is kind of a chore. It pretty much has tank controls, which is fairly standard for 3D games at the time that were using pre-rendered backgrounds, but it also means the fixed camera angles make navigation a massive pain in the ass. This means that basically no matter how good, quote-unquote, you are at the game, you're still bumbling around like a complete idiot. It is incredibly easy to get stuck on scenery, to be swinging just a few pixels off even though your angle looks good from your viewpoint. It's just a disaster, really. The second reason is that the combat system itself is just downright terrible. I've already mentioned that the controls are crap, but when you take into account that not only is the forward lunge your preferred melee attack, but even the ranged weapons in this game, which do have a limited supply of ammunition, I might add, are controlled the same way. And the only way you know that you're actually aiming at something is if a small circle appears on that particular enemy. And you still have to be facing the right direction for it anyway. So then you're holding the control key and pressing forward to fling rocks at enemies or shoot them with guns of various descriptions, and it just ends up being ridiculous. And this is only made even worse by the fact that all of the enemies take quite a few hits to go down, and they can pretty much stun lock you, which is downright infuriating. So you're sitting there clumsily flailing around like a moron trying to deal damage to these damage sponges while they just basically laugh in your face, block half of your attacks, and then smack you with attacks that do quite a lot of damage. So this ends up ruining the core gameplay mechanics, but you know what? They take it even further than that. The game is on a time limit. There's a bar that gradually fills up over time, and the way you reduce that bar is by collecting those memory chips and depositing them at various stations scattered throughout the levels. Those weird plasma ball kind of things, yeah, those are the stations, and the way you activate them is you go up to them and you press the spacebar, because the spacebar is the action button, which is used for climbing and jumping and all that sort of thing as well. And you sit there and wait while it deducts memory chips from your stash that you've been collecting throughout the course of the level and puts them into reducing the bar. You also can get this effect applied when you finish a level, though it does it automatically instead of you having to specifically go to a terminal. Of course, you also have to be careful at the end of a level too, because if you go from one epoch to another, then you end up actually losing all of your weapons and have to gain all new ones. And that really sucks. What luckily doesn't reset when you get to the end of a level is how many health bars you have, unless you died at the end of a level, in which case you lose a health bar. You see, the game has extra lives. Now, you can continue a level as many times as you need to finish it, but if you want to get through and still have all your health bars, then you're going to need the extra lives. And the way the extra lives work is whenever you die, instead of just dropping dead and having to restart the level, you end up flashing for a few moments, and during that time you're invincible, and you lose one of your health bars, but your health up to that point is replenished, and you can continue to fight. As for replenishing your health throughout the course of the level, there are red and yellow orbs that you can find all over the place, and the yellow ones restore partial amounts of your health, whereas the red ones restore a full bar's worth of health. And trust me, you're gonna be needing those a lot. With the combat system being as much of a disaster as it is, you're just gonna end up taking a lot of damage, so you're gonna need to replenish your health just as quickly. And the later you get in the game, the less health it gives you. Because that's what we really needed, was a game that's bullshit to get even more bullshit. I don't mind difficult games as long as they're fair about being difficult. Time Commando is artificially difficult just by nature of how incredibly awful its mechanics and controls are. It is a supremely frustrating game that is a product of its time in all of the worst ways. In fact, the only redeeming quality is that it's funny to watch someone try to play this the first time, because then they're just flailing around like a moron getting incredibly frustrated at it. It's one of those things where it's funny to watch because it's just so incredibly bad, but if you try to play it yourself, you find that it is an extremely frustrating game that has basically no redeeming qualities whatsoever. If you enjoy this game, it's probably on one of two levels. One, it impressed you back in the day, so you're nostalgic for it, or two, it's just something you find funny because it's so incredibly bad. But there is no reason at all for you to go back and play it these days. It is a game that should have been lost to the mists of time. Even still, if for some utterly baffling reason you want to pick this up, I will have a link to the GOG page for it in the video description. But don't say I didn't warn you that it is complete garbage. Thanks for watching.